The Colorado sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Broken Creek, turning what had once been fertile pasture land into a wasteland of dust and dying cattle. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her brow as she hauled another bucket of precious water from the well, her calloused hands testament to months of backbreaking labor that seemed increasingly futile. "Pa, we lost another 2 head overnight," her younger brother Tommy called out from the barn, his voice carrying the weight of defeat that had settled over their family like the persistent dust clouds. James Mitchell emerged from the house, his weathered face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen daily. At 52, he'd survived the Civil War, claim jumpers, and harsh winters, but this drought was testing him in ways that bullets and blizzards never had. "That makes 17 this month," he muttered, kicking at the hardpan soil. "At this rate, we'll have nothing left come winter." Sarah set down the water bucket and studied the horizon, where heat mirages danced like ghosts across the barren landscape. The other homesteads scattered throughout the valley were suffering equally. The Johansons had already packed up and headed back east, and the Garcias were talking about moving their remaining cattle to New Mexico territory, where grass might still grow. "Maybe we should consider Senor Garcia's suggestion," Sarah ventured carefully, knowing her father's pride was as stubborn as the drought itself. "There's talk of green pastures down south near Santa Fe." "This is our land, Sarah," James replied firmly, his jaw set with the determination that had carried him through 2 decades of frontier life. "My father's bones are buried in that cemetery on the hill, and I'll be damned if I'll abandon what we've built here." The sound of approaching horses broke through their conversation, and Sarah shielded her eyes against the glare to make out 3 riders cresting the ridge that bordered their property. As they drew closer, she could see they weren't the usual visitors, no supply wagons or neighboring ranchers. These men rode with a different bearing, and something about their approach made her father reach instinctively for the rifle he kept propped against the porch post. The lead rider was an older man, perhaps 60, with long grey hair braided with leather strips and wearing a mixture of traditional Cherokee clothing and practical frontier attire. His face was deeply lined, speaking of years spent under the open sky, and his dark eyes held a gravity that made Sarah's breath catch. Behind him rode 2 younger men, clearly his companions rather than followers, each carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of those who belonged to this land in ways the settlers never could. "James Mitchell," the elder called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty yard. "I am Joseph Ridge of the Cherokee. We need to speak." Sarah felt her father stiffen beside her. The name Ridge carried weight in these parts. Everyone knew the stories of the Cherokee removal, the Trail of Tears, and the families who had somehow avoided the forced march to Indian territory decades earlier. But seeing one of them here now was like having history itself ride up to their front door. "What brings you to my property, Mr. Ridge?" James asked, his tone carefully neutral, but his hand still resting near his rifle. Joseph dismounted with fluid grace despite his age, and Sarah noticed how his moccasined feet seemed to read the earth beneath them, finding the few spots where the ground wasn't completely hardpan. "This drought has lasted 8 months, he said, his English precise but accented with the rhythms of his native tongue. "Your cattle are dying, your crops have failed, and your well grows shallow." "That's no concern of yours," James replied, though Sarah detected uncertainty beneath his defensive words. "The land makes it my concern," Joseph said simply. "What you call your property sits above the sacred burial grounds of my grandmother's people. The spring that feeds your well flows from stones blessed by 7 generations of Cherokee medicine people. The drought will continue until the balance is restored." Tommy had emerged from the barn and now stood beside Sarah, his young face a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. At 19, he'd heard the old stories, but had never seen a Cherokee up close. Sarah herself felt drawn to this weathered man, who spoke with such quiet authority about things her family had never considered. "Are you threatening us?" James asked, his voice hardening. Joseph's expression remained patient, almost sorrowful. "I am explaining what many of your neighbors refuse to understand. This land remembers. The bones of my people cry out from beneath your cattle pens and your planted fields. Until proper respect is paid, until the old ceremonies are observed, the earth will remain closed to the sky." Sarah stepped forward, ignoring her father's sharp look. "What ceremonies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph's gaze shifted to her, and she felt as though he was seeing not just her face but something deeper, her character, her heart, her willingness to listen. "The rain calling," the blessing of the spring, the honoring of those who walked this path before us. Simple things but powerful when done with proper understanding. Superstition, James muttered, but Sarah noticed he didn't raise his voice. Your science cannot bring rain, Joseph replied calmly. Your prayers to the white man's God have gone unanswered. Perhaps it is time to consider that the Cherokee way of understanding this land might offer wisdom your people lack. The sun continued its relentless assault, and Sarah felt sweat trickling down her spine as she considered the old man's words. Around them, the evidence of the drought's devastation stretched in every direction. Dead grass, empty water troughs, cattle gathered listlessly in whatever shade they could find. What exactly are you proposing? She found herself asking, earning another sharp look from her father. Joseph smiled for the first time since his arrival, and the expression transformed his weathered features. A sharing of knowledge, daughter of Mitchell, your family's cooperation in restoring the sacred places, and in return the teaching of ways to read the sky and earth that your people have forgotten. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the dust around their feet, and Sarah could swear she smelled something different in the air. Not the promise of rain, but perhaps the possibility of change. The tension in the yard grew thick as morning molasses as James Mitchell wrestled with Joseph Ridge's proposal. Sarah watched her father's weathered hands clench and unclench at his sides, a sure sign he was fighting an internal battle between his pride and the stark reality of their situation. You're asking me to let you dig up my land, James said finally, his voice strained. To perform your rituals on property I've worked for 20 years to build. I am asking you to acknowledge what was here before you arrived, Joseph replied with patient dignity. The burial grounds lie beneath your eastern pasture, where the ground refuses to hold water no matter how much you irrigate. Your own experience tells you something is wrong there. Sarah's breath caught. It was true. That particular section of their land had always been problematic. Crops failed there even in good years, and livestock avoided grazing in that area unless driven to it by hunger. Her father had always blamed it on poor soil, but now she wondered if there might be another explanation. Tommy, who had been listening with the intense focus of youth, stepped forward. Pa, remember what old Miguel Garcia told us about that spot? How his grandfather's cattle used to refuse to cross it? Superstitious nonsense, James muttered, but his conviction seemed to be wavering. Joseph gestured to one of his companions, a man in his 30s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone comfortable in both worlds. My nephew David studied at the Indian school in Carlisle before returning to our people. He understands the white man's ways of measuring and documenting. Perhaps he could explain what we observe in terms your mind can accept. David Ridge urged his horse forward and dismounted with easy grace. Mr. Mitchell, I've spent time with your neighbors, the Petersons north of here. They've noticed the same pattern, certain areas where nothing grows, where animals act strangely, where the ground stays cold even in summer heat. From a scientific perspective, these could indicate underground disturbances, unusual mineral deposits, or water table irregularities. Sarah found herself impressed by the young man's articulate explanation. He was bridging two worlds, offering rational explanations while respecting his uncle's traditional knowledge. What David's saying makes sense, Pa, she said carefully. We've always known that eastern section was different. James removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as surrender approaching. And you believe that honoring these burial grounds would help with the drought? I believe that understanding the land properly is the first step toward working with it instead of against it, Joseph said. My people lived here for countless generations. We learned to read the signs, to know when rain would come and when it would stay away. This knowledge didn't disappear when we were forced to leave. It simply went underground like water during a drought. The third Cherokee, a younger man Sarah guessed to be about her own age, had remained silent throughout the exchange. Now he spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent but perfectly clear English. The old weather patterns are changing, but the fundamental signs remain the same. Uncle Joseph has been tracking the movements of birds, the behavior of insects, the way certain plants respond to pressure changes. There are indicators that suggest rain will come within the month, but only if the natural flow of water across this land is restored. Sarah studied this younger man with growing interest. Unlike his companions, he wore entirely Western clothing except for a single beaded armband, and his hair was cut shorter, though still longer than most white men wore theirs. He met her gaze steadily, and she felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. I'm Samuel, he said, addressing her directly. I've been away at university studying meteorology and geology. What my uncle speaks of in traditional terms, I've learned to understand through scientific observation. Both approaches point to the same conclusions. University? Tommy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Samuel replied with a slight smile. I was one of 3 Indians in a class of 47. It was educational in ways beyond the curriculum. James was clearly struggling with the reality that these weren't the savage Indians of popular imagination, but educated, articulate men who understood both his world and their own. Sarah could see her father's preconceptions crumbling, replaced by a grudging respect. What exactly would this cooperation involve? James asked, his tone more thoughtful now. Joseph spread his hands. Permission to conduct ceremonies at the burial site. Assistance in clearing the spring that feeds your well. It has been blocked by debris for many years, and perhaps most importantly, the sharing of knowledge between our peoples. We can teach you to read the signs that predict weather changes, to understand which areas of your land are best suited for different purposes. In return, we ask only for respect and recognition of our connection to this place. And you believe this would bring rain? James pressed. David stepped forward again. Uncle Joseph has been predicting weather patterns for 40 years with remarkable accuracy, not through magic, but through careful observation of natural phenomena. The current atmospheric conditions suggest that a significant weather system is building to the west. Traditional Cherokee weather reading indicates it should reach this area within 2 to 3 weeks, but only if the natural water flow across the land is unobstructed. Sarah felt her heart racing. The possibility of rain, of salvation for their ranch and their way of life, seemed almost too good to believe. But more than that, she was fascinated by these men who moved between worlds with such apparent ease, who offered practical solutions wrapped in traditions she was only beginning to understand. There's something else, Samuel said, his eyes still fixed on Sarah's face. The work of clearing the spring and preparing the ceremonial site will require help from your family. It's not something we can do alone, and the cooperation itself is part of what makes the process effective. Your participation would be essential. James looked around at his dying ranch, at his children's faces, at the endless expanse of drought-stricken land. Sarah held her breath, knowing that his next words would determine not just their immediate future, but perhaps the entire direction of their lives. When would you want to start? He asked quietly. Joseph's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. Tomorrow at dawn, if you're willing. The moon is right, and according to the signs Samuel and David have been tracking, we have perhaps 2 weeks before the weather pattern shifts. After that, we may have to wait until next season. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. Tomorrow their quiet life would change forever, and she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for what that might mean. Dawn came early to the Mitchell ranch, bringing with it a tension that seemed to crackle in the dry air like distant lightning. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with anticipation and uncertainty about what the day would bring. She'd risen before the rooster's call to prepare breakfast for the work crew, her hands trembling slightly as she mixed biscuit dough in the pre-dawn darkness. The Cherokee men arrived precisely at sunrise, their punctuality impressing James despite his lingering reservations. Joseph rode at the front, carrying what appeared to be ceremonial items wrapped in deerskin bundles, while David brought surveying equipment that looked surprisingly modern. Samuel led a pack horse loaded with tools, shovels, picks, and rope that would be needed for the spring clearing. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," Joseph called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Are you ready to begin?" James emerged from the house, coffee cup in hand, his expression resolute despite the worry lines etched around his eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be," he replied, "though I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what I've gotten myself into." Sarah stepped onto the porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. The sight of Samuel dismounting with fluid grace made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. In the morning light, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he moved with confidence despite being on what was technically foreign ground. "The first step is understanding the land itself," David explained, unrolling what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "We've been observing this area for several weeks, tracking water flow patterns and identifying the locations Uncle Joseph remembers from his childhood." Tommy bounded out of the house with the enthusiasm of youth, clearly excited by the prospect of adventure. "Where exactly are these burial grounds?" he asked, earning a sharp look from his father. Joseph's expression grew solemn. "Follow me, young Mitchell. But remember, we walk on sacred ground. Your people may not understand our ways, but respect costs nothing and earns everything. The group made their way across the hardpan toward the eastern section of the ranch, where the problematic pasture stretched out under the climbing sun. As they walked, Sarah noticed how differently the Cherokee men moved across the landscape, not fighting it or imposing themselves upon it, but reading it, responding to subtle cues she was only beginning to perceive. Samuel fell into step beside her, his presence both comfortable and unsettling. "You seem troubled," he observed quietly. "Not troubled," Sarah replied, searching for the right words. "Curious, maybe? And a little afraid of what we might find. Fear of the unknown is natural," Samuel said, "but sometimes the unknown holds answers we desperately need." They crested a small rise, and Joseph stopped abruptly, his weathered hand raised for silence. Below them lay the section of pasture that had always given the Mitchells trouble, a roughly circular area perhaps 50 yards across, where the grass had never grown properly, and the ground remained stubbornly hard, despite years of cultivation attempts. "Here," Joseph said simply, 12 graves in the old way, arranged according to the sacred directions. My grandmother's sister lies at the center, with her children and grandchildren around her." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the morning heat. The circular area looked exactly like what Joseph described, a family burial ground that had been disturbed by years of farming attempts. David knelt and began taking measurements with his surveying equipment while making notes in a leather-bound journal. "The soil composition here is definitely different," he reported. "Higher clay content, different drainage patterns. From an agricultural standpoint, it makes sense that crops would fail here." James walked slowly around the perimeter of the area, his practical farmer's eye taking in details that years of frustration had trained him to observe. "The cattle have always avoided this spot," he admitted reluctantly. "Even when the grass was better elsewhere, they'd graze around it, but never through it. Animals sense what people often ignore," Joseph explained. "They feel the presence of the ancestors, the weight of history in the ground beneath their feet." Samuel began unpacking the tools from the pack horse while his uncle prepared the ceremonial items. "The spring that feeds your well originates about a quarter-mile upstream," he explained to Sarah. "Over the years, flash floods and debris have blocked the natural channel. Clearing it should restore proper water flow to this entire section." "How do you know all this?" Tommy asked, his young mind clearly fascinated by the intersection of traditional knowledge and practical expertise. "Stories passed down through generations," Samuel replied, "combined with geological training and careful observation. My uncle remembers this land as it was before the settlements, and I've learned to understand those memories through the lens of modern science." Joseph had finished his preparations and now stood at what he indicated was the center of the burial ground. In his hands, he held a bundle of sweet-smelling herbs and a small clay bowl. "Before we disturb this ground, even to honor it, we must ask permission from those who rest here," he explained. "This is not superstition, it is respect." Sarah watched, mesmerized, as the elder Cherokee began to speak in his native language, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match the morning breeze. Though she couldn't understand the words, the emotion behind them was unmistakable: grief for the dead, respect for the sacred, and hope for healing. When the brief ceremony concluded, Joseph nodded to his nephews. "Now we begin the work," he said, "but carefully, always carefully." The next several hours passed in a blur of physical labor, unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Under Joseph's careful direction, they began the delicate process of clearing debris from the natural spring channel. The work was back-breaking, moving fallen logs, digging out accumulated silt and repositioning stones to restore the ancient water flow. But as they worked, something remarkable began to happen. The ground that had seemed permanently hardpan began to show signs of moisture. Tiny springs bubbled up in places where none had been visible before. The earth itself seemed to be responding to their efforts. "Look at that," James breathed, pointing to a trickle of clear water that had begun flowing through the channel they'd cleared. "I haven't seen water move through here in 5 years." Samuel paused in his digging, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. "The water was always there," he explained. "It just needed a clear path to follow." Sarah found herself working beside him, their hands occasionally touching as they moved stones and cleared debris. Each contact sent small jolts of awareness through her, and she noticed he seemed as affected by their proximity as she was. "Your family is fortunate," Samuel said during a brief rest, his eyes scanning the gradually recovering landscape. "Many settlers refuse to listen to what the land is trying to tell them." "And what is it telling us?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Samuel smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. That cooperation creates abundance, that respecting what came before doesn't diminish what comes after, that some problems require solutions older than our immediate experience. As the sun reached its zenith, the transformation of the eastern pasture was becoming undeniable. Water flowed where none had flowed before. The ground showed signs of softening, and even the quality of light in the area seemed different, less harsh, more welcoming. James stood surveying their morning's work, his expression a mixture of amazement and growing respect. "I have to admit," he said to Joseph, "this isn't what I expected when I agreed to your proposal." Joseph's weathered face creased in a gentle smile. "The best solutions rarely are, James Mitchell. Sometimes the path forward requires looking back to understand where we've been." But as Sarah looked toward the horizon, she noticed something that made her heart sink. A dust cloud was approaching from the south, riders moving fast and with purpose, and given the tensions in the territory over land rights and Indian presence, she had a sinking feeling that their fragile cooperation was about to face its first serious test. The dust cloud resolved into 5 riders, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. Sarah recognized the lead rider immediately, Caleb Morrison, the Territorial Land Commissioner, a man whose reputation for dealing harshly with Indian problems had earned him both fear and respect throughout the region. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't know, but their bearing suggested they were either lawmen or hired guns. The 5th rider made her blood run cold. Ezra Blackwood, whose neighboring ranch had failed spectacularly 2 years earlier, leaving him bitter and desperate for someone to blame. "This doesn't look good," Samuel murmured, setting down his shovel and moving instinctively closer to his uncle. Joseph straightened slowly, his weathered hands remaining steady despite the obvious threat approaching. "David, move the ceremonial items away from here," he said quietly. "No need to give them additional reasons for anger." James Mitchell stepped forward, positioning himself between the Cherokee men and the approaching riders. Despite his initial skepticism about the morning's work, Sarah could see that he wasn't prepared to abandon his new allies. "Stay calm, everyone," he said. "Let me handle this." The riders reined in their horses 30 feet away, forming a loose semicircle that effectively trapped the work party against the restored spring. Morrison dismounted with the swagger of a man accustomed to wielding authority, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. "Mitchell," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the harsh edge of official displeasure. "What in hell do you think you're doing here?" "Working my own land, Commissioner," James replied evenly, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Last I checked, that wasn't a crime in Colorado Territory." "Working with renegade Indians is," Morrison shot back. "These Cherokee were supposed to be relocated to Indian Territory decades ago. Their presence here is illegal, and anyone harboring them is breaking federal law." Ezra Blackwood spurred his horse closer, his face twisted with the kind of rage that comes from personal failure seeking a target. "I told you these savages were the cause of our troubles, Morrison. Look at them, performing their heathen rituals on good Christian land." Sarah felt her temper flare at the slur, but Samuel's gentle touch on her arm kept her from speaking out. She could see the wisdom in his restraint. Escalating the confrontation would only make things worse. Joseph stepped forward with the dignity that had impressed Sarah from their first meeting. "Commissioner Morrison, I am Joseph Ridge. My family has lived in these mountains since before your grandfathers were born. We are not renegades. We are simply people trying to share knowledge that might help everyone survive this drought." "Don't give me your noble, savage speech," Morrison snarled. "I've heard it all before. You're trespassing on federal territory, and I have the authority to remove you by force if necessary." David Ridge moved closer to his uncle, his Carlisle education apparent in his careful choice of words. "Commissioner, we're not claiming any land rights. We're simply providing agricultural consultation to Mr. Mitchell, who invited us here of his own free will. Nothing we're doing violates any territorial or federal statutes." One of Morrison's companions, a hard-faced man with a deputy's badge, laughed harshly. "Agricultural consultation? That what you call your witch doctor nonsense?" "Actually," Tommy Mitchell spoke up with the fearless honesty of youth, "they've already gotten water flowing where we haven't seen any for 5 years. Look for yourself." Sarah held her breath as Morrison's gaze shifted to the newly flowing stream, his expression flickering between surprise and suspicion. The evidence was undeniable. Clear water bubbled up from springs that had been dry for years, following channels that the morning's work had cleared. "Coincidence," Blackwood declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "Rain's coming anyway. Been building in the west for days. Samuel stepped forward, his university education giving weight to his words. Mr. Blackwood, I've been tracking the atmospheric conditions for weeks. The weather system you're referring to won't reach this area for at least 10 more days, and when it does arrive, it will only benefit land where the natural drainage has been properly restored. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel's Western clothing and educated speech. And who might you be, boy? Samuel Ridge, sir, graduate of Colorado College, currently pursuing advanced studies in meteorology and geology. Samuel's voice remained respectful but firm. I can provide scientific documentation for everything we've accomplished here today. The revelation that one of the Cherokee was a college graduate clearly unsettled Morrison, who had obviously expected to find ignorant savages performing primitive rituals. His carefully prepared accusations suddenly seemed less applicable to the reality before him. James Mitchell seized the moment of uncertainty. Commissioner, these men have done more to help my ranch in one morning than the territorial government has done in 5 years of drought. If they're willing to share their knowledge with other struggling ranchers, shouldn't we be encouraging that cooperation instead of threatening it? It's not about what works, Morrison replied, though his tone had lost some of its earlier aggression. It's about law and order, about maintaining proper boundaries between the races. Whose law? Joseph asked quietly. The law that drove my people from land we had lived on for countless generations? The law that promised us new homes in exchange for our cooperation, then broke those promises when it became convenient? Or perhaps the law that allows white settlers to fail where Cherokee wisdom might help them succeed? Sarah watched the commissioner's face, seeing the internal struggle between his prejudices and the evidence before his eyes. The flowing water, the obvious improvement to the land, and the articulate, educated Cherokee men didn't fit the narrative he'd come prepared to enforce. Blackwood, however, seemed to have no such internal conflict. I don't care if they're college professors, he snarled. Indians are Indians, and this is white man's country now. Every problem we've had, the drought, the cattle deaths, the crop failures, started when these heathens began sneaking around our territory. The drought started 2 years before we arrived, David pointed out calmly. Weather records from Colorado Springs clearly document the timeline. Weather records, Blackwood spat. More college boy nonsense. What I know is that my ranch failed, my cattle died, and my family's living in poverty while these red devils practice their devil worship on land that should be feeding Christian families. The tension in the air was becoming explosive, and Sarah could see that Morrison's men were growing restless. Hands were drifting toward weapons, and the slightest provocation could turn the confrontation deadly. Then, unexpectedly, the wind shifted. A cool breeze swept down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of moisture and the sound of distant thunder. Everyone looked up instinctively, and Sarah felt her heart leap as she saw what appeared to be clouds building on the western horizon. That's impossible, Blackwood breathed. The sky was clear an hour ago. Samuel smiled grimly. Weather patterns can change quickly in the mountains, especially when natural drainage systems are restored to proper function. The cleared springs create evaporation that feeds cloud formation. It's basic meteorology. Morrison stared at the approaching clouds, his certainty clearly shaken. You're saying you can predict when rain will come? Not predict, Joseph corrected gently. We can read the signs that tell us when conditions are right for rain to come, and we can prepare the land to receive that rain when it arrives, but only through cooperation, not through threats and division. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splashing into the dust around their feet. Sarah tilted her face up to feel the moisture on her skin, hardly believing what was happening. After months of praying for rain, it was finally beginning just as the Cherokee elder had said it would. Morrison remounted his horse, his expression grim, but no longer openly hostile. This isn't over, Mitchell, he said, but I'll give you 1 week to prove that this arrangement benefits the territory. If I hear of any trouble, any complaints from other ranchers, I'll be back with a full detachment of cavalry. As the riders departed, the rain began to fall more steadily, and Sarah found herself standing in the first real precipitation they'd seen in 8 months, wondering if her family's desperate gamble was about to pay off in ways she'd never imagined. The week that followed Morrison's ultimatum transformed not just the Mitchell Ranch, but the entire understanding of what was possible when cultures chose cooperation over conflict. The rain that had begun during the confrontation continued in gentle, steady patterns that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Yet Samuel's careful weather documentation proved that every drop followed predictable atmospheric conditions that Cherokee traditional knowledge had simply learned to read more accurately than white settlers. Sarah stood on her family's porch in the early morning light, marveling at the transformation around her. Where drought-killed grass had stretched endlessly just 7 days before, new green shoots now pushed through the softened earth. The cattle, no longer listless and dying, grazed contentedly in pastures that had seemed permanently barren. Most remarkably, the eastern section where the burial grounds lay had become the most productive part of their land. With water flowing freely and grass growing so quickly, it seemed like a miracle. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Tommy said, joining her with a cup of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. At 19, he'd absorbed the week's lessons with the enthusiasm of youth, spending hours with David Ridge learning to read weather signs and understand the subtle relationships between land, water, and sky. "It's not the same place," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "We're not the same people either." Through the morning mist, she could see the Cherokee camp they'd established near the restored spring. Joseph had insisted they remain close to the sacred site during the critical first week, both to ensure the ceremonies were properly completed and to be available for the practical work of teaching the Mitchells and their neighbors the traditional knowledge that had made the transformation possible. Word of the Mitchell Ranch's sudden recovery had spread quickly through the drought-stricken territory. Despite Commissioner Morrison's warning about Indian troubles, desperate ranchers had begun arriving to see for themselves what combination of Cherokee wisdom and scientific method had accomplished. Yesterday alone, 5 families had made the journey from as far as 30 miles away, drawn by reports of flowing water and green grass in a land that had forgotten both. James Mitchell emerged from the house, his transformation perhaps the most remarkable of all. The bitter, defensive man who had greeted Joseph Ridge with suspicion and hostility had evolved into someone who spoke respectfully of the old ways and eagerly participated in the morning discussions where Cherokee traditional knowledge was shared alongside scientific observation. "Samuel's waiting for you down by the spring," he told Sarah with a knowing smile. "Says he wants to show you something important before the others arrive." Sarah felt her cheeks warm despite the cool air. Over the past week, her relationship with Samuel had deepened beyond mere attraction into something that felt both inevitable and impossible. He was everything she'd never known she wanted: intelligent, respectful, bridging 2 worlds with apparent ease. But he was also Cherokee in a territory where such relationships faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. She found him kneeling beside the spring that had become the heart of their shared endeavor, taking measurements with instruments that combined traditional Cherokee weather-reading techniques with modern scientific methodology. His notebook was filled with careful observations, documenting not just rainfall and water flow, but the intricate relationships between land restoration, atmospheric conditions, and agricultural productivity. "The patterns are holding," he said without looking up, though his voice carried satisfaction. "Uncle Joseph's predictions about the long-term weather cycle appear to be accurate. If we continue the restoration work on other ranches, this could break the drought across the entire region." "That's wonderful news," Sarah said, settling beside him on the soft grass that had grown up around the spring. "But you sound troubled." Samuel finally met her eyes, and she saw the conflict there. Hope mixed with realism, possibility tempered by hard experience. "Morrison will be back today with his decision, and even if he allows us to continue here, expanding to other ranches means dealing with people who may not be as open-minded as your family." "Some will be," Sarah said with conviction. "Desperation has a way of opening minds that prejudice has closed, and others will see success as a threat to their understanding of how the world should work," Samuel replied grimly. "Ezra Blackwood hasn't given up. David heard rumors in town that he's been spreading stories about Cherokee sorcery and warning people that trusting Indians will lead to massacre and theft." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she recognized Commissioner Morrison's distinctive silhouette. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him rode not armed men, but what appeared to be a delegation of territorial officials, including some she recognized as successful ranchers from the more prosperous northern districts. "Time to see if a week of success is enough to change minds that have been closed for generations," Samuel said quietly, rising to meet whatever judgment was approaching. The delegation reined in near the house, where James Mitchell and the Cherokee men were already gathering. Joseph stood with the quiet dignity that had impressed Sarah from their first meeting, while David held his documentation of the week's scientific observations. Tommy bounded out to join them, his youthful enthusiasm undaunted by the gravity of the moment. Morrison dismounted with less swagger than he'd shown the previous week, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the transformed landscape. "Mitchell," he said formally, "I've brought some colleagues who wanted to see for themselves what you've accomplished here." One of the ranchers, a prosperous-looking man Sarah recognized as Benjamin Walsh from the Northern Valley, stepped forward with obvious amazement. "Is this really the same land that was barren a week ago?" he asked. The report seemed too incredible to believe. "See for yourself, Mr. Walsh," James replied with justifiable pride. "The eastern pasture that couldn't grow grass for 5 years is now producing better than any section of the ranch." As the delegation walked through the restored areas, Sarah watched their faces change from skepticism to wonder to something approaching hunger. These were practical men who understood the value of water in drought country, and the evidence before their eyes was undeniable. Joseph walked alongside them, explaining in his patient way how Cherokee traditional knowledge had identified the problems and suggested solutions that modern scientific method had then documented and refined. David provided technical details that satisfied the educated members of the group, while Samuel's weather predictions proved accurate as light rain began to fall exactly when he'd said it would. "The question," Morrison said when they'd completed their tour, "is whether this success can be replicated elsewhere without creating complications." "What kind of complications?" Walsh asked bluntly. "If these methods can restore my failing ranch, I'm not concerned about the color of the men who teach them. The law still requires that Cherokee individuals be relocated to Indian Territory," Morrison replied carefully. "However, territorial statute does allow for temporary residence permits for individuals providing essential services. If the Cherokee gentlemen were willing to work under such permits, and if local ranchers formally requested their assistance," Sarah felt her heart leap with hope, but Joseph's expression remained cautious. "And what would such permits require of us, Commissioner?" "Regular reporting to territorial authorities, restriction to specified areas, and acceptance that the arrangement could be terminated at any time if problems arise." Samuel stepped forward, his education lending weight to his words. "We would need assurance that our traditional practices would be respected and that we wouldn't be prevented from teaching the complete system of land stewardship that makes this approach effective. As long as those practices don't conflict with territorial law or Christian morality," Morrison replied. Sarah saw the careful negotiation taking place, the delicate balance between practical need and legal prejudice. But she also saw something else, the hunger in the ranchers' eyes as they contemplated salvation for their own failing lands, and the gradual recognition that cooperation might serve everyone's interests better than continued conflict. "There's one more consideration," Walsh said thoughtfully. "If word of this success spreads beyond the territory, we could have every failed rancher in the West converging on Colorado looking for Cherokee miracle workers. That could create problems none of us are prepared to handle." Joseph nodded gravely, "which is why the real solution isn't Cherokee teachers working indefinitely on white ranches. The real solution is white ranchers learning to read their own land properly so they no longer need us to survive." The simple wisdom of the statement seemed to resonate with the delegation. Here was an approach that offered immediate help while building toward long-term independence. Exactly what practical men facing immediate crisis needed to hear. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah watched something remarkable unfold. One by one, the visiting ranchers committed to requesting permits for Cherokee assistance on their own lands. Morrison, faced with unanimous support from the men whose opinions carried political weight in the territory, agreed to draft the necessary documentation. But the most significant moment came when Ezra Blackwood arrived with 3 armed men, clearly intent on disrupting the proceedings. Instead of the sympathetic audience he'd expected, he found successful ranchers who had seen undeniable proof that cooperation worked better than conflict. "Blackwood," Walsh said coldly, "your ranch failed because you fought the land instead of learning from it. These Cherokee gentlemen have accomplished in 1 week what you couldn't manage in 5 years. I suggest you swallow your pride and ask for their help, or find somewhere else to peddle your bitterness." As Blackwood retreated in defeat, and the officials completed their arrangements, Sarah found herself standing beside Samuel in the gentle rain that had become the symbol of their success. The future remained uncertain. There would be challenges, setbacks, and people who would never accept what they'd accomplished. But for the first time since the drought began, she could envision a future where 2 cultures might not just coexist, but thrive together. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Samuel smiled, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. Now we teach others what we've learned here, and we discover whether one successful partnership can grow into something larger than either of our peoples imagined possible. As the rain continued to fall on the restored land, Sarah realized that they had indeed witnessed something miraculous, not supernatural intervention, but the miracle of human cooperation, overcoming the barriers that fear and ignorance had built between them.